So agenda. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about some high-level overview of Web3 system design. I know you guys have been talking a lot about those same kind of things from a technological perspective. We're going to look at it from governance, securities, how are these moving pieces come together? How do we think about decentralization? You guys probably think about it from technological decentralization. We're going to look at it from like a legal perspective. What does that mean? What are the types of tools that we use to underpin that legal strategy, and why does it matter? And then we're also going to cover kind of an overview of the different laws and regimes that we're working with. We're going to get into a little bit more detail around securities. So you've probably heard the term Howey test. What does that mean? What's current? How do people think about it in practice? It's one thing to follow somebody on crypto Twitter where they're railing about the risk of launching a token or an airdrop, but what actually happens in like a large token launch, and what are the strategies and how are people actually doing it? And then we're going to talk about some token design stuff at the end if we have time. And this isn't it's a good group. I don't mean to say like small, but it's small enough to where it's easy for you guys to ask questions. So feel free to come off mute. It won't be rude, and just interrupt Ben or me, and we'll stop and answer questions. All right. So what is the difference between a Web3 startup and a Web2 startup, right? And to date myself, I'm in my 18th year as a corporate lawyer. For the first decade or so, I was representing what I would consider normal corporate startups, right? Centralized for-profit venture-backed companies. What does that mean? Well, the main difference, in my opinion, is that we are on a path to decentralization. So if you are Apple, right, there's no path to decentralization. You've got a corporate network, all these, phones that are out in the world, and you're selling upgraded hardware, you're selling, services, and you're really controlling the ecosystem. Every time a developer launches an application, you're going to charge a fee rake on the services and all of the things that go along there. That is a traditional centralized corporate network. And with the Web3 version, what we're going to do is we're going to build a decentralized open ecosystem. So there's going to be some level of infrastructure that we're going to develop. There's going to be applications or services that we're going to sell on top of it. But the main thing is that we are going to have this sort of community that we're going to build and empower users to build. And that results in a lot of different things as you're planning and building and working your way through how you're thinking about your ultimate business, your ultimate exit, and how do you build things, okay? So the first one is, let's talk about governance and control, right? I'm just going to use Apple as an easy example, right? But you could insert basically any company into this. So when Apple or a company like Apple thinks about governance, they've got their stockholders at the top of the stack. They've got their board elected by stockholders. And then they've got sort of the management team that is making the day-to-day decisions, right? And that's a sort of a traditional corporate structure. In our labs entities, we'll have that, use the term labs entities, development companies, but our sort of core centralized contributor will have that sort of structure, but it's not the ultimate goal, right? And on the other side of that, you've got something like a DAO, right? I'll pause on this and talk a little bit about it. That can mean different things to different people in what you're looking at building and how you're approaching it. So when I use the term DAO here, I just mean a community-driven organization. Does that mean that we're going to have a completely on-chain, kind of like a Cosmos ecosystem, app chain system? Is it a foundation with strong leadership? What are all of these different things? But there's going to be some level of community engagement. And there's a wide range within that. So as I sort of alluded to, there are unwrapped ecosystems that are going to be taking liability. There's a bunch of reasons why we use an entity that's a blocker. To a strong foundation, a lot of my early L1s operate that way, meaning that there's a foundation that's a nonprofit entity, has been seeded with treasury, and its goal is to advance the ecosystem, but it is not sort of mob rule community design where just anyone can put up a proposal, and if it's voted through, then the foundation must implement it if it takes off-chain activity. And so when we're thinking about, again, I want to keep this pretty high level, when we're thinking about what is the difference between Web 2 and Web 3, we are spending a lot of time thinking about what does community engagement look like, what is the DAO construct, governance, foundation, And how is all of that going to look? In a traditional Web 2 company, obviously none of that is even relevant. You have some gaming companies and other folks I've worked with over the years that are a centralized company. They engage with their community to get feedback and product iterate, but this is very different than handing control over to a community. So that's a big deal. And we use different structures. And so oftentimes it is a centralized corporation that starts, depending on where people pay taxes. Delaware C Corp is very common, but it can also be a Cayman Corp, BVI Corp, et cetera. But we start with that centralized company. And then we typically use some sort of foundation company. You've probably seen those out in the wild. Solana Foundation is an easy one to use an example. So that's sort of the legal structuring things that we're considering and around governance. I'll pause there and just, if there's anyone with questions, I'll just pause from time to time and see if anyone wants to come off mute and chime in there or ask anything. Hearing none, I'll keep going. Another way that we think about it in terms of the structures and the underpinning are intellectual property. So again, let's use Apple as an example. Proprietary technology. They're going to have patents, trademarks, trade secrets, and if you infringe Apple's technology, they're going to enforce their IP rights, right? Microsoft, Amazon, it doesn't matter. Someone is enforcing those intellectual property rights, and they control that network. One of the big differences with Web3, and again, it depends on the model, and I'll touch on a couple of them, but with the overwhelming majority of your peers, there is some part of the overall technology stack that's going to be open source. So any sort of protocol, whether it's an L1, an L2, a DeFi protocol, but we are making a major portion of the intellectual property stack open source. And that's very different than your Web 2 counterparts, where their whole business model is, we've created proprietary technology, B2B SaaS, B2C, whatever it is, and you have to pay us to use the software. At a high level, a classic Web 2 monetization strategy. Here, what we're doing is we are saying, here's SMTP. Enjoy it. It's free. It's open source. But if you want to use Outlook, you got to pay for Microsoft Office, right? And so we've got our protocol layer that is this base infrastructure that we're going to be building valuable intellectual property on. That's going to be that application layer. And again, models vary. Sometimes that GUI is just a fancy block explorer and there's not really any proprietary intellectual property. With some of your gaming peers, there really isn't much protocol layer. It's just wizard sword NFTs and resources and things like that. And there really isn't a protocol in the sense of like an L2, ZK rollup or something. And so how we think about building intellectual property, how do we launch that thing through different open source strategies, and then how do we incentivize third-party developers to build on this open and permissionless system? So very different. How do we think about monetization? And the application layer is typically pretty clear, right? If you have a business that is going to have some sort of for-profit application layer, again, Microsoft Outlook, you charge $10 a month. I get my Outlook suite. I'm using SMTP. I didn't know it the whole time, but I am. And I'm making money on that application. I will give away the protocol for free. One of the things that, I don't know if this has come up with any of your other classes, one of the things that comes up a lot is inviting competition into the ecosystem. I spent a lot of time talking with people about that. And so there's this sort of people that are transitioning from Web 2 to Web 3. It's not immediately obvious around this strategy. But what it is why would I want to have an open and permissionless set of plumbing where Microsoft developed it? They have Outlook, but now you can use Gmail and Hotmail and any other sort of email service. I invited people in there. Well, for most Web3 system designs that I use, we just want everyone to use our plumbing. So we might make some revenue with the application layer, or it might be completely free. But given the tokenomics, right, and this would go back to your sinks and faucets, does it cost something to use the protocol? And that won't go to the centralized company and your stockholders and your founders and all of those kind of things, but we're going to be big bag holders. And so as the protocol gets more robust, as more people are using it, as more value flows through the pipes, the tokens that we are holding go up in value. And so even if I have lots of companies where we sort of say the labs company or the development company, it's not really worth anything, right? We might have raised a lot of money in that entity at high valuations with equity and token warrants, but the reality is that the labs entity isn't worth anything. We're just kind of making products and services that we're giving away free to further the ecosystem because we want people to use our plumbing. Not because we're going to make revenue at the top line, but because our tokens will appreciate. The other thing too around this is anytime we're having an open system design, competition is a bit illusory. We're all startups. You're never going to be able to tackle the entire market. So let's say that you've got a application with a use case in the United States. Well, who's going to lead the charge on your Japanese strategy? Who's going to be in Osaka getting people to use that application in converting everything to Japanese? In a traditional Web 2 context, you'd set up a Japanese subsidiary. You'd say, oh, we got to hire people. We've got to do product market fit. We've got to make sure that it's a totally different culture. It's a different language. Will people use the product in the way that we think they are in the United States? Where in Web 3, we're going to go, here's a grant builder. Here is free money. Nope, we don't want any of your revenue. We don't need anything in exchange. We want you to go build out an application on our plumbing that is localized for the Osaka, Japan market. And is it cannibalizing our market? Not really. We're giving them money to go build it because it's something that we would never have the scale to tackle every single vertical in the globe in the time frame that we need to tackle that as a startup. And that is how I think about scaling Web3 businesses in a way that you can as a startup and immediately go from 0 to 60. So again, structuring that foundation that I talked about, oftentimes a Cayman Foundation company, is the vehicle by which we will make those grants and get people those native digital assets that they can consume, sell, whatever it is to further that development. So our business model is going to be pretty different than a traditional Web 2 business. Now, again, and I will, I'm sort of saying this sort of every time, every model is different. A gaming company with a centralized game that's just incorporating wizard swords and gold and those types of things likely isn't the one that we're going to, have that sort of design space in. Different issues, right? And so what are some of the different issues that we have to talk about versus my old life as a Web 2 securities expert versus now as a Web 3 expert? And the answer is, when I was a Web 2 lawyer, the only thing that could have been a security was our financing. So common advice was, you can talk about anything factually business, just don't talk about your Series A right now. Talk about the product, talk about the business. And we'll have a press release after it closes, all of those kind of things. Where now we start with, what is the thing? Before it was Series A, preferred stock. We know that's a security. And factual business information, a product. So we start out, what is the thing? Is it a security? Is it a commodity? Is it a currency? And these aren't hard frameworks to where you just neatly put the peg in the hole. Can be all of the above, can be none of the, well, it can't be none of the above, it's a thing. But there can be gray area in the design. And so one of the hard things, just to illustrate the point, is now when I'm talking to people about securities law compliance and public communications, the thing that is the product is also the thing that might be the security. So for the first 10 years of my life, it's not complicated legal advice. Don't talk about the security publicly, talk about your product. What do you say about a token? You have to be able to talk about your business. You have to be able to talk about your product. And it is the thing that might be the security. It gets blended. These are unique issues that are only present in Web3. Apple doesn't worry about that. They're going to file their 10K, their 10Q, their proxy. They're going to talk about the iPhone upgrade. They're not going to be out there talking about their stock unless it's, sanctioned and the lawyers have signed off on it and it's like an earnings call, very contained. If Apple's phone was a potential securities offering, the marketing communications would look very, very different. And this pops its head in a bunch of different ways. Another one is taxes. People spend a lot of time talking about the securities laws, and I'm a securities expert. It's low-hanging fruit. You can Google it. You can read a couple articles on CoinDesk. Everyone is a, Howie expert these days, right? Or Reeves, if it's debt, maybe get a little fancy. The taxes are very, very complicated. How do you get the tokens into the hands of the founding team, the development company, in a tax-optimized way? In the old world, when someone would come to me and we'd form a new company at the very beginning, and you guys have all done this, you'd get shares of stock, you'd put in some nominal intellectual property, some nominal cash, you'd file an 83B, and you'd do it on Stripe Atlas or Clerkey or a law firm it's like Autodocs. It's just forms, you plug in the numbers. The reason why that works is the stock is property under Section 83 of the Internal Revenue Code, so you can file an 83B. There's a Internal Revenue Code 351 that lets you do that transfer of intellectual property and cash for stock, tax-free. None of that applies with tokens. We had to come up with a completely novel and bespoke system to get to that same outcome, where you have tokens in the hands of the labs companies, founders, everyone sort of around the rim, to where they don't have a recognition of it, and they're going to hopefully get long-term capital gains when they sell in the future. Totally different issues that your Web 2 counterparts don't have to deal with. VASP laws, Bank Secrecy Act, you might have heard of FATF guidance. We're making currency. Even NFTs, by a strict letter of the law, digital currency. But we're not a financial institution. Those are different things. At least we're designed to not be. How do we think about that? What is an appropriate level of know your customer? What is an appropriate level of AML? We have open system designs that are permissionless. What happens with OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control? What happens when a North Korean starts using your product or sends money through your L2? What do you do? Web 2 people, they have this if you're Circle, right? But you have a compliance department and you take KYC, and everyone that's used CFI, even if it's stacked on top of DeFi, has sent the selfie of their passport and into the thing. How are you going to manage that? Do you need to manage that? Again, just different issues that our Web 2 counterparties, unless they're a financial institution, don't have to deal with. Intellectual property, open source, which license, BSL, MIT, and then what part of the overall technology stack do we open source and do we make proprietary? With your other peers, it's all proprietary, not a lot to think about, generally speaking. For here, we spend a lot of time pulling apart what part should be open source and what part should not. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. There's a lot of complexity around that. And then taxes, how do you move that intellectual property out of a corporate US solution into a non-US foundation? Very heavy tax issues to deal with that. And that's typically the way that it works. Two more and then I'll stop and let you guys ask me questions. Here's the most fundamental. What bodies of law apply from what country? Bitcoin, Ethereum, any sort of open system design. What countries do we even look at for applicable law? And then what bodies of law? Is it the Cayman securities laws? Is it the US securities laws? Is it the US Bank Secrecy Act? Is it the VASP laws of the Caymans? Is it something else? I've got a user in France. We've got a gaming system. It looks like gambling. Do French gambling laws apply? We don't have any touch point other than it's an open and permissionless system where people from France are engaging with this. Am I going to get sued in France? Sounds pleasant. Those are the types of things that we have to deal with in Web3. And then the kicker is, and no one's going to know how to apply the laws. So you say, all right, look, I've decided that it is French gambling laws. That's the applicable body of law. All right, how are you going to apply that body of law to a series of smart contracts deployed to an L2? where we're not hosting a front end or a GUI or doing any marketing. Discuss. And you're going to get some French lawyer wearing a bowler hat and they're not going to have a clue. And so these are very difficult and unique challenges. So I'll pause there. Ben, did I miss anything, or is that kind of the right list of horribles? Yeah.
That was a pretty good overview.
Yeah. So those are the things that we're dealing with, and they're different than your peers. Guys from the group, what do you think? Questions? All right, keep going. Ben, why don't you take the next slide? Or do you want me to do this one? I'm happy to do it.
Take this one. I'll take securities right after.
Okay. So why does this matter? Right? And part of this is, right, so 30 seconds on me, we sort of skipped over the background. I was a traditional securities lawyer. In 2016, I became a Bitcoiner. It's not really more complicated than that. Once that happens, at least the way I just got goosebumps even saying it. Once that happens, for me, my life changed. I knew I had to work in the industry. I had to work in the space. Philosophically, the ethos, everything about it. I knew I had to do this. And so why does this matter? Like, why are we doing these things? People have different points of view. It's not really legal, but I think it's important to orient yourself into why at least I'm here and why I think it's important. I think we want to democratize the internet and finance. You've got these corporate technology hierarchies. You know who they are. I won't name them, but you know who they are, and they dominate things, and they censor, and they control things. And third-party developers that are creating the value, the builders, are getting raked over the coals by the corporate take rate. You've got these closed networks versus an open network. Have you ever read anything or seen anything Chris Dixon from A16Z? He's got a good analogy that I've liked, where one is the corporate network is Disneyland. You're walking through and you see like, oh, that's great. There's Minnie Mouse, there's Mickey Mouse, and here's a terrible piece of pizza. It's very curated, it's very clean, and you're seeing exactly what Disney wants you to see. The internet should be New York City. When you are walking down the street and you can see whatever the hell somebody put on the side of the street. And you're going to have different restaurants, and you're going to have different vendors and all of those things. And it's a totally different experience. And that's what I want. Just as a human being, just as a consumer, just from like a normative value statement. I want to walk through New York City. I don't want to spend my life walking through a walled garden of Disneyland. And I think we're going to have better outcomes. One of my friends, I haven't spent that much time in New York, but one thing I love was he told me this story. He spent a lot of time there. And he said, one of the things I love about New York City is that when I eat a gyro from a gyro cart, I know that that is the best gyro that I can get for the lowest possible price. Because there is so much competition in New York that if that gyro cart was not the best damn gyro in the city, it would have been ran out of business because somebody else would have came along with the gyro cart that would have had a better gyro for less money. And so every time I walk into a restaurant, every time I go to a show, every time I open my wallet and I have some experience, I know that the free market has developed the best possible gyro that I can possibly have for $8. And that competition is what makes America great. It's what makes a society great. It's all of these ideas and these things coming in. And so I think as consumers and as a country and as an economy, we will have better outcomes. You ever had a gyro at Disneyland? It's not going to be the best gyro you ever had. The guy on the side of the street at 2 a.m. coming out of a bar in New York City is slanging the best damn gyros you've ever had. I promise. So why does that happen? Well, it lowers the barriers to entry. Composable IP. Great buzzword there. What does that mean? Well, we're putting a lot of open source building blocks. When I first started a lawyer, long time ago now, people had to raise more money. It took a lot longer to get product to market. The venture capitalists, I love them. They're my friends. They controlled everything. It was hard to build product and get it out. With open source software, composable pieces, and an infrastructure to build on, you can raise less money, get more product out more quickly. More people can enter this New York City of Web3 and put their Euro card out there. I don't have to go raise $100 million and build a bunch of proprietary technology. A lot of the base infrastructure and a lot of the tools are publicly available. I'm going to plug in a MetaMask wallet. Easy. Got it. Done. What's next? I'm going to deploy on Arbitrum. Great. What's the next piece? It makes things so much easier. I think we get diversity, competition of ideas. Because of that, it all feeds together. I've never seen such a collaborative thing. I use the term multidisciplinary a lot. Legal multidisciplinary, but also technical business leaders, people coming together. My clients don't really view themselves as competitors. Like, is Solana a competitor to Metaplex? I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like the concept doesn't really make sense. Because you go back to our first principles, where I started with my Osaka, Japan example. We want that company in Osaka to be wildly successful. Their success is our success. I want as many successful applications on my plumbing as possible. I will give them money and resources and tools and co-market them in advance. And then that goes into our ethos. And all of that is a virtuous cycle. I've talked about greater consumer choice. That's important. Let's talk about the freedoms. This is going on a lot right now. I don't know how old this is, but I just listened. It took me 2 days because I'm busy. I just did the Elon Musk, Tucker Carlson interview. Free speech and censorship. I can't believe it's 2024 and we got to worry about that. But I am glad that Elon Musk bought Twitter. Disneyland. Web3 is going to bring all that down. Or at least gives us the tools for a fighting chance. That's important. I've got 2 kids, 7 and 10. Think about where we're going as a country, as a society. My eggs are in the Web3 basket. Can't have them controlling everything. Not to make this political. I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat. I don't care. I think everyone wants open communications and freedom. It's a good thing. Oh, it's a good thing. They'll tell you it's not. It is. It's definitely a good thing. And then going back to our Apple example, these corporate overlords that control everything, financially, economically, the message. I want hundreds or thousands of entrepreneurs and applications, not just what some product designer thought was what I would want. Rewarding stakeholders in a network. This is just common sense, right? In a Web 2 model, all the value accrues to the stockholders. I've got some Apple stock in my 401k. Great. All the value goes up to the stockholders. In Web 3, we can reward builders, contributors, community members that vote in governance, that build different applications through grants. You can own a piece of it. Build a real community of people that are aligned with incentives and engagement and distribute that value out. It's not possible in a Web 2 model. Is Apple going to give away stock to everyone that buys an iPhone? Why do I use an iPhone? Because it's easy. Not because I'm incented to and aligned and feel like I'm a stakeholder in the success of this ecosystem. It's much more compelling to be aligned and have a sense of ownership and actual ownership and engage through token holder governance about the direction of an ecosystem that you care about because you're a contributor and you have an economic incentive to do it. How do you get early adopters? I think about the network effect businesses. How do you get people? How are you going to disrupt a well-entrenched network effect business? You got to get early adopters involved. You don't have the marketing budget and the resources to do it. So you're an early adopter, you're going to get awarded some tokens. It's an airdrop. That's what that is. Fancy names for it. You're incentivizing early adopters. Give them a piece of the network. Great. I'm more likely to try a product or a service, go out of my way to do it, if I can be an early adopter and get rewarded for my time. for my eyeballs, for my feedback, for contributing to the community and saying, hey, I tried your product, here's the things I don't like. It's a good part of it. Content creators, right? Think about Super Rare, OpenSea, people that are creating. Artists have been starved for years, put off to the side. They can go direct to consumers now with their art. Take out the middle man. Same thing with music and other content. It's YouTube on steroids. And those models have been great for creators. But this is even better. And then just ordinary customers, right? People that are just using things, coming in off the street. You can reward them and incentivize them. Alaska Airline miles, but better, right? Frequent flyer rewards, those types of things. And that's one of the things I love is that we have basically an infinite design space. What do you want your token to be? Is it Alaska Airline miles? Is it a financial incentive for early adopters? Is it that we're all going to coalesce around a common utility and we need to have really sophisticated people that hold the token so they can vote around this plumbing infrastructure so we can all build our businesses? We got to have street sweepers and potted plants and all this. We got to have a main road in New York that's well groomed and well kept. So the barbershop's successful, so the restaurant's successful, so all those kind of things. All of those vendors and restaurants and everything else, they want that common street to be great and to look good so they can build their business. Let's share the benefits and the burdens of making sure that Lex is a great street and that consumers want to walk down that street. It's the digital version of that in some models. And so maybe you don't need consumers to have it. It's not Alaska Airline miles. It's the stores in the neighborhood saying, we want new plants. These plants are looking a little old. We want a stoplight here. Let's make a change. So the point I'm trying to make there is big design space. What are you doing? What matters? And then you think about that and then you build that into the overall system. Governance, tokens, communication strategy, technology, infrastructure, all of those things. All right, I'll pause there again. Questions? Or Ben, did I miss anything?
I don't know about you guys, but I've heard a similar presentation a few times now, and every time I'm ready to put on my war paint and go to battle. So
No, you can straddle the line between at one end it felt like I could get a sense of like Bill Murray in Caddyshack, sort of like, well, this is what I've got going for me. Then like
when you die,
a rallying cry. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm curious to kind of bring it back to when you're working with a client, right? And you're working with a company.
Mhm.
How do you navigate or balance, right? Like that want or need for predictability, right? And I think this kind of as the industry grows and evolves, right? We ask from the SEC, give us a clear instruction that we can follow, right? That you haven't really given us yet, and we'll adapt to that. How do we navigate that with like these fundamental kind of drivers and interests behind the whole industry as a whole?
I'll tell you, and I'm not sure you're going to fully believe me. I frequently, here's the test I tell people. You have to be comfortable with discomfort. I can't give you certainty. I can help you make the right risk-adjusted decisions for you and help you build a strategy and help you marry up the business opportunity with the risk and help to make sure that it's worth it. But if you are not comfortable with discomfort, then you're in the wrong industry. And that's the part that I don't think you, like as a lawyer, like the number of people that I've met, and they're like, Andy, we want to hire you. We're going to go, build all this stuff. And I'm like, I don't think so. I think it's a great product. And you got a great team, but I don't think you've got the balls for it. Sorry to say it that way, but like, you don't like, you are going to demand in your brain and your DNA is going to require a level of certainty that is not available in this industry at this time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you should go do something else. Take all your time and your talent and the investors' money that they're throwing at you, and you should go do something else. Or do the Web 2 version of it and then come back to me when you're ready for prime time. You have to be able to have that level of comfort. And now the secret, though, is that risk is priced in, and that's what makes the business opportunity. If we were just making euros on the side of the road in New York, you wouldn't have the valuations, you wouldn't have the business opportunity. That euro cart, the margins are squeezed down to the bare minimum. It's that risk and complexity that is in the system that creates one of the things that creates the business opportunity. And sometimes I'll see the same model and I won't take on that team because I don't think they have what it takes to deal with the legal issues that I can predict are going to come. And then sometimes I'll say, all right, same model, but these guys have what it takes. They're going to be able to deal with the intellectual rigor, complexity, and all of the things that we have to do to set up this global system. And I'm making some prejudged based on a couple of conversations, but I'm picking teams and winners to work with. Yeah.
No, that's a great point and a great way of putting it, because I think especially for like companies that are like a part of this cohort, right? When you're going out and let's say fundraising, for example, the different potential investors or funds that you're speaking to, right? If they're not fluent in Web3 investments and, like a Web3 specific fund, they might be looking and expecting certain assurances that you just can't give them, right? And that doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong or your model is wrong or the business is wrong. But I think understanding that and kind of keeping that in mind is important. And I mean, I've encountered it myself. My first job in Web3 was at a company. It was in 2017. They were one of the earliest Ethereum ICOs. They did their ICO when ETH was at like $7, and they held on to that ETH for some genius reason. Yeah. And so I got there, and all of a sudden, it's a massive company because it was like February 2018. And so they decided we're a bigger company now. We have a lot more money. We need to bring in people that have more corporate experience that like know how, have built big companies, worked at big established startups. They brought them in, and all those people were saying, well, we can't do this because of this. Like, we need this thing in order for you to be a real business. And there was this constant friction between the original team and the founders that were Web3 true believers and this like new wave of kind of experienced C-level individuals they brought in, because there wasn't that understanding of this assumption of risk in this emerging industry that we're in. It's not traditional Web2 startups, and that really affected the overall success of that company because of this sort of daily infighting where the founders sort of like, this is what we're doing. We're here, like we've got to push the envelope, or why are we even trying this at all?
And that's why public companies can't compete with us. So over the years, I've worked with some of the largest public companies on their internal skunk work Web3 projects. And I've got like a business team and then some compliance lawyer that never talks sitting there. And they're just, I mean, and my phone rings immediately after, and there's like, there's no way that we're ever going to be able to do any of this stuff. And I'm going, we're just getting warmed up, right? And sometimes it's funny, like even this happened to me in my Web 2 life, a long time ago, but in particular in Web 3, it's like, well, why isn't Facebook doing it? If it's such a good idea, then why isn't Amazon doing it? Right? And I'm like, oh, you have definitely not worked with one of these big companies, right? There is no, it's hilarious to think that they would do the things that we're building, or that they could build them and do them. There's no way. It's antithetical to their DNA. They couldn't do it. It's better chance they could fly, grow wings and fly than Visa is going to build a DeFi protocol. You got to be kidding me.
I had one question, a little bit more on just the legal setup idea, but what are you thinking about like companies nowadays setting up as like a UAE top co and then a BVI or Cayman subsidiary, and just the whole idea around UAE as another?
So a couple different things. So as a U.S. lawyer, right? I probably set up 3 non-US entities for every 1 US entity that I set up. Okay, just to give you a scope of what I'm sort of dealing with every single day. And the decision for our initial company is completely mechanical and tax-based. There's something called controlled foreign corporation. You might have heard the term CFC floating around. And so it depends on where the equity holders are going to be paying taxes. And it's like now, and then you kind of got to predict it. And so we don't have a lot of flexibility in terms of, okay, I don't know if you're a US taxpayer, but if you are, we're not setting up a Cayman company for you. It's not like it would personally bankrupt you to do it that way, right? And so where we get a lot of flexibility is around the other Web3 parts of the design. So where is our foundation? Do we have any other sort of subsidiaries below that? I've got everything from, I use a lot of Cayman Foundation companies. Some of the older L1s I have set up, they were Swiss back in the day, but now we do a lot more Cayman. I spend a lot of time looking at and considering some of the Middle East jurisdictions, but they haven't really made a lot of sense for any of our use cases. The other thing too, I'll do a little bit of jujitsu with your question. This wasn't your question, but a lot of times people just ask me like, okay, Andy, what's the best jurisdiction? Is it Dubai? Is it UAE? Is it Cayman? Like, what is it? And the answer is, do you like bananas or lobster? In the morning, I like to have a banana, right? But I love a lobster for dinner. Doesn't make one better than the other. They're just different, right? And so same thing with our choice of jurisdiction. I use, what do we use, Ben? Gibraltar for a lot of gaming things, like gambling gaming, because you can't use them in the Caymans. And so like, depends on your model. So like, how do we think about that? Cook Islands has really good DMCA protection. So if you're thinking about decentralized music streaming and things like that, Cook Islands can be a good choice. So Cayman tends to be a good international jurisdiction, but it's not the only one that we use. And for example, gaming is an example. In that case, I mean gambling, right? Also, if you're going to monetize proprietary intellectual property, you can't use Caymans. Weird, right? And so you got to sort of pick different jurisdictions based on the model. So I have not had a lot of companies where we've looked at UAE, Dubai, and those kind of things, and it's made sense for a variety of reasons. It tends to be expensive. Yeah.
Thanks. And we are actually a gaming company, so thanks.
Gaming.
Gaming.
Yeah, I mean, it's just because like one is like, video games. The other is like, we use the term gaming, but they're different, right? And so you can look at like BetDex or Sportsline or some of my other builds, or we've got Poly Markets, which kind of rhymes with that. I've got a lot of things where, we've had to think about creative jurisdictions. Yeah, Garrett, I see your hand up there.
Sure. Hi, Andy.
Hey.
I have a kind of open source licensing question for you. So a lot of your presentation was about these proprietary, Web 2 models versus kind of these open Web 3 models. So at least for our business, we noticed in the DApp layer that almost all of it was still proprietary. Like you pay SaaS to get access to an endpoint. So we did this quite bold move to fully open source all of our wares, including our backend. But now we're have very tricky situation in how do we still monetize that properly. And I've looked quite intently into the Apache license, and specifically like how you do notice files and potentially even like gamifying, turning those notice files like into NFTs, things like that. I was just curious, in your opinion, MIT, Berkeley, etc., is there a certain license that you like better than others? Or how do you kind of recommend navigating this whole licensing open source situation?
So I'm not an IP lawyer, and so would not be the right sort of Fenwick brain to go deep on it with you. What I will say is that we have the big thing that we see a lot of is between BSL and everything else. That's kind of the big decision because you have to upgrade it over time, right? It gives you sort of a little bit of moat around the IP. So apologies, not one I can sort of like deep dive on, like here's the benefit of MIT versus Apache. I'm not sure if there would be a monetization difference for you there. Yeah.
No problem. Thanks, though. And if there's anybody you can point us to over there, I'd certainly love to.
Happy to do so. I'll follow.
We'd be happy to chat with you about that.
Yeah, definitely.
we keep driving?
Yeah. If there's any other questions, yeah, let's keep going. Go ahead, Ben.
Okay, there's not too much time left, so I'm going to move quickly here. This is really to discuss the securities framework, but this slide is really to show you that this is just one piece of the puzzle. There are a lot of other legal regimes that may be applicable to the token, the protocol, the decentralized application, whatever it is that you're building, what your product is. And so just to call one out here, you'll see CFTC on the screen, which is the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. And I bring that up just because the current FIT 21 bill that's working its way through Congress is a bit of a knife fight between the SEC and CFTC to see which agency will have control. Currently, it depends on the stage of the project, which is ironic because this is intended to create certainty, but the current bill in its current iteration, at least, could continue this path of uncertainty. So moving along, this here is the definition of security in the 1933 Act. And highlighted here is the term investment contract. And it's really comes down to a threshold question. Is whatever it is that you were offering, is the offer and sale of that token a security? And the way that the SEC has created the hook for it being a security is through the definition of investment contract. I think that there's some progress there, right? In the sense that I said, is the offer and sale of the token a security? If we were having this conversation a couple of years ago, we would just be saying, is the token a security, right? Based on how the SEC has positioned this in the past. But they've kind of started to shift in the direction of the industry, right? And recognizing that it really is the offer and sale of the token that creates that security. If it is a security, then you have to comply with securities laws where possible, right? And so what does compliance look like? Under securities laws, every offer and sale of securities must either be registered with the SEC or exempt from registration. And registering a token with the SEC is a practically impossible exercise, right? It's doable. It's been done under Reg A, but it takes a couple of years. It can cost upwards of millions of dollars. And it's just a timeline and a budget that a lot of startups do not have. And so in most cases, that means that you're looking for an exemption from registration for the transaction. And again, that's where available and where you can still meet the business objectives. The reason why I say where you can meet the business objectives is because at some point, you will not be able to do so while executing on your business plan if you're constantly or solely focused on whether or not the transaction is exempt from securities laws, right? And so one of the initial places where we see that, at least pre-Ripple, was in connection with the airdrop, right? When you're going live and deploying the token and doling it out to all of the early users and adopters of the protocol or the application. And really at that point, you have to decide, do we want to include US users, or do we want to take a more conservative approach, geo-block the US, screen IP addresses, potentially screen VPNs, and really focus on non-US. And post-Ripple, I would say that a lot of the clients that we work with have increasingly decided to include US retail in its airdrop, but again, it's a case-by-case decision. So let's move on. Okay, so whether or not the offer and sale of the token is an investment contract, and therefore a security, the test for that is Howey, and Howey, Andy alluded to the Howey test earlier. It's an antiquated case from the 1940s determined by the Supreme Court, where orange groves were offered and sold to retail for better or for less. And in connection with the sale of these orange groves, the purchasers were promised that a third-party company, right, would manage the property, they would cultivate the fields, they would sell the oranges, and this would result in a return on the investment for purchasers. And that worked its way up through the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court determined that that package was a security, right? And the test that they used was the Howey test, and it was looking at these 3 or 4 factors, depending on who you're asking, where there's an investment of money in a common enterprise with an expectation of profits from the managerial or entrepreneurial efforts of others. In the case itself, they said solely from the managerial or entrepreneurial efforts, but over time, that solely piece has been read out by courts. And so let's quickly tease apart these different elements to see what the strategy that we often approach when advising our clients for how to mitigate some of the securities risk, right? And so to begin with, is there an investment of money? Traditionally, this has been read very broadly. In light of the Ripple ruling that I brought up earlier, it's now at least some companies decide to apply more of a narrow ruling to this, right? And so in Ripple, the courts really looked to whether or not there was an actual investment of money as opposed to just time or labor or something that was less tangible than investment of money itself. And they also looked to who received that money, right? Was an investment of money that went to the company that was offering and selling this token, or was the money going potentially to a secondary market and implied bid-ask transaction where the users did not know who the downstream or ultimate recipients of the money was. A couple of limitations from Ripple are at this point, I know that the SEC recently announced that it's appealing and filed that appeal, but until the appeals court actually rules on this case, for now it's just persuasive authority. It's not actually binding, right? So that means that another district court that is looking at a similar case or a challenge that a company offered and sold securities in an unregistered securities offering, they can look to the Ripple case as potential precedent, right? But they're not actually bound by following the Ripple court's reasoning there. So next is the common enterprise element, right? And there are 2 flavors of this. There's horizontal and there's vertical. Most courts apply the horizontal test, which is really looking at whether there's a pooling of funds and investors' fortunes being tied to each other and the overall enterprise. The vertical test is a bit more flexible in nature than the horizontal test. It doesn't require actual pooling of funds. And instead, courts look to whether fortunes of investors are tied to the fortunes of the promoter, oftentimes the devco. In many of the cases that we've seen, courts and the SEC, they largely just assume that this common enterprise exists based on the fact that the devco and the downstream recipients or purchasers all hold the same token and therefore their fortunes are tied together. Next, for expectation of profits. Here, the key really is communications and your marketing strategy is when it comes to mitigating this prong of the Howey test. And I think one of the questions that projects need to ask themselves is it possible, based on the business objectives and the business goals, to position the token truly as a utility token as opposed to a potential investment that generates a yield for purchasers, right? And so if you go down that path, it's just a very different strategy when it comes to raising capital, issuing the tokens, doing pre-token sales. And really what you're doing is you're limiting at a very high level the amount of tokens that somebody could purchase to what they would reasonably be able to consume themselves, right? As opposed to purchasing 1 million tokens, knowing that it's going to appreciate 20%, 30%, 100x in value, whatever it is. For the expectation of profits and the efforts of others prong, which is next, the SEC came out back in 2019 with something called the FinHub framework that was supposed to provide some guidance for companies, but forget if it's like 40 plus, 50 plus factors. It added more confusion than I think it clarified. But just noting that they have tried to at least potentially clarify this in the past. And so for the efforts of others prong, right? And this is where Andy talked about one of the differences between Web 2 and Web 3 is this path to progressive decentralization. the efforts of others prong is that path, and right, and being able to carry out this, eventually the argument that if the Bahamas test, right? If the founders disappear, right? If they walk away, if they retire to the Bahamas drinking Mai Tais all day, will whatever the protocol is, the application is, will it continue to operate on its own? Or are the initial core contributors so fundamental to the ongoing success of this entire ecosystem that their disappearance from the map will result in the cratering of the ecosystem, right? And so the goal for all of our clients is for the founding team to pass the Bahamas test. I guess one closing piece on the progressive decentralization is I know we were focused in going through that pretty quickly on securities analysis, but if you figure out how to properly decentralize whatever it is that you're building, you've likely also significantly mitigated your tax risk, potential money transmission risk. So it's not just that decentralization itself is part of the ethos of people building in Web3, but by truly tapping into that ethos, you will mitigate a lot of the risk that exists. That doesn't mean you shouldn't still talk to your lawyers about it, of course.